Hello dear listeners. Welcome to your channel. This is the summary of the Sabbath School Lesson 4 for the second quarter of the year 2025. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the thumbs up icon to support our mission of teaching the Bible around the world. The title of this lesson, The Nations. Part 1. The memory text is found in Book of Daniel chapter 7 verse 14. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. Watch until the end of this video to listen the memory verse song of this lesson. Dear listeners, this lesson explores the rise and fall of human nations, tracing the development of worldly power and rebellion against God from the days of Nimrod to the call in Revelation for God's people to come out of spiritual Babylon. It emphasizes that God's ultimate goal is the establishment of his eternal kingdom, where he will reign in righteousness, and his people, drawn from every nation, will serve him in unity. The big picture. The key memory text from Daniel 7 verse 14 speaks of a future where Christ is given universal dominion and an everlasting kingdom. The book of Revelation mirrors Genesis in reverse, showing how the world, marred by sin and rebellion, is ultimately restored. Human governments have long sought to rule apart from God, often with disastrous consequences. But the Bible assures us that God's kingdom will triumph. One of the key issues in both Daniel and Revelation is worldly government, a succession of human attempts to control a planet that rightfully belongs to God, who will, once this horrible episode of sin and rebellion is forever ended, ultimately rule in righteousness. It is a very long process that leads to this moment, covering thousands of years of human experiments in self-government. They have never worked. Even those expressing the highest ideals have always fallen short, often terribly short, of those ideals. So much of the sad history of humanity through the millennia is nothing but accounts of the tragedy that these failed systems have brought upon us. And it only will get worse until God's everlasting kingdom finally is established. Sunday, Nimrod and Nineveh, the rise of rebellion. Genesis 10 introduces Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord, who establishes cities such as Babel and Nineveh, later infamous for their opposition to God. Rather than being a hero, Nimrod symbolizes rebellion and self-glorification. This section explains how human efforts to reclaim what was lost in Eden often result in prideful attempts to create man-made power structures, which further alienate humanity from God. Nimrod's legacy marks the beginning of human empires formed in defiance of God's authority. Why is the sin of rebellion against God more subtle than we might realize? How can we protect ourselves against this very human trait? Monday, Abraham's call, a holy nation is born. In the 10th chapter of Genesis, we see the birth of various nations. The word usually translated nations is goyim, which also can refer to Gentiles. Genesis 10 tells us that the human race divided up into lands, languages, families, and nations. Almost immediately after the introduction of this concept, God calls Abraham out of one of those nations to be different from them and from what they represent. Genesis 12 recounts God's call to Abram to leave his homeland. Out of the nations described in Genesis 10, God chooses one man to start a distinct nation, Israel, intended to live under God's kingship and to bless all other nations. Israel's purpose was not nationalistic pride, but to reflect God's character and law to the world, drawing others to him. Dear listeners, the identity of God's people is not about privilege but purpose, living in obedience to reveal God to the nations. Tuesday, given what you asked for, Israel chooses a human king. As originally established, Israel was not to have a human monarch, the way that other nations did. In time, however, the people's faith faltered, and they found themselves pining for the things that the nations had. 1 Samuel chapter 8 tells the tragic turning point where Israel demands a human king to be like other nations. This request was a rejection of God's direct rule. Despite warnings of the burdens a king would impose like taxes, conscription, abuse of power, the people insisted. As a result, God allowed them to have their way with painful consequences throughout their history. Back then, or even today, all human governments share one thing in common. sinners governing other sinners. What possibly could go wrong? When people reject divine leadership for worldly models, they invite oppression and spiritual decline. Wednesday, the rulers of the Gentiles, a warning to the church. Jesus warns in Matthew 20 verses 25 to 28 against adopting worldly methods of leadership within his church. This day's study draws parallels between ancient Israel and the early Christian church. Israel asked for a human king, a request that led to the moral downfall of the nation. The kings became progressively more wicked until God allowed the Babylonians to take his people captive as a matter of course correction. Something similar happened in the history of the Christian church. Even though they were not to structure themselves like a Gentile nation, when Constantine came to power and professed to be a Christian, believers were relieved persecution was now ended. That in itself was a blessing, but then it occurred to the church that they might be able to leverage the power of the emperor to their own advantage. After the Roman Emperor Constantine's conversion, the church began compromising with worldly power. Seeking state help led to corruption, hierarchy, and persecution, dark echoes of Israel's past. We as the church must resist the allure of worldly success, influence, and control. True greatness is found in service. Thursday, a light to the Gentiles. God's mission through his people. Israel was meant to be a beacon of righteousness that drew the nations to God, not repelled them. Tragically, because of disobedience, they became a warning instead of a witness. The Israelites acted as they should have and done what they had been told to do. The nations would have come to them in peace, seeking to know more about them and their God. Tragically, as the Babylonian captivity showed, these nations came to wage war instead. The ultimate showcase of God's character, of course, was Jesus, the only human who has perfectly demonstrated it. But his perfect example, which certainly brought conviction to hearts, was intended as an invitation. Jesus ultimately fulfilled the mission Israel failed to accomplish. Today, the church is called to finish the work of spreading the gospel to all nations, echoing Israel's original calling. Revelation 18 urges God's people to call others out of Babylon, symbolizing false religious systems. This is a task for the entire global church. Friday, further thought, compromise, and corruption. The final reflection focuses on how the mystery of iniquity infiltrated the early church. Ellen White warns of a slow, subtle erosion of truth as pagan practices were merged with Christian faith. Once persecution stopped, compromise with worldly power accelerated. Her insights challenge believers to stay vigilant against pride, tradition, and worldly influence. Big question: how much of Babylon, false teachings, pride, idolatry might still exist in us or in the church today? God using outsiders. The stories of Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus show that God can use anyone, even non-believers, to accomplish his purposes. Faithfulness, not ethnicity or background, determines one's usefulness to God. Even if we're no longer in Babylon, we must ask whether Babylonian values, power, pride, materialism exist in our hearts or systems. The only cure is genuine repentance, a return to simplicity, and dependence on God's Spirit. In summary, this lesson challenges us to reflect deeply on human history and our own hearts. The nations, empires, and governments of the past and present are fleeting and flawed. Only God's kingdom offers true peace and justice. God's call has always been to create a people distinct from the world, shining as lights to guide others to him. Whether in ancient Israel or the modern church, the challenge remains the same. Will we truly be his people? God bless you.
Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an